What if your baby was crying uncontrollably? And the entire world around you chose to look away. Rachel hadn't slept in 2 nights. Her arms ached, her eyes burned. And on that crowded airplane, her baby's cries weren't just noise, they were silent screams for help she no longer had the strength to ask for. Passengers turned their heads. Flight attendants sighed. No one moved, except him, a stranger in a crisp suit, a man who didn't offer pity but presence. He held her baby as if he'd known loss. He looked at her not like a problem, but a person. Would you trust someone like that? When you're at your lowest, when even your reflection doesn't recognize you, could you accept a hand reaching out, not to judge, but to understand? This isn't a love story. It's a story about compassion in unexpected places, about what it means to fall apart in public and be met with gentleness instead of shame. If you've ever been on the edge and hoped someone might notice this story is for you, like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, because sometimes the smallest gestures rewrite the biggest chapters. Now, let's begin. The crying echoed through the cold, sterile air of Terminal B like a wounded animal, cutting through the buzz of rolling luggage and intercom announcements. Rachel Whitman stood near Gate 18, swaying gently back and forth with her 9-month-old son, Caleb, pressed tightly to her chest. His cries were raw, desperate, almost primal, and she could feel the stares. Those familiar, sharp stares. Not again, she thought, squeezing her eyes shut for a moment. The last thing she needed was another public meltdown, but Caleb was tired, hungry, overstimulated, just like she was. A man nearby muttered something under his breath. She didn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The tone said enough. She offered a quiet, "I'm sorry," even though she knew it wouldn't matter. People weren't interested in explanations. They wanted peace, silence, order. Not a mother with a screaming baby and a worn-out duffel bag that looked like it had seen better days because it had. Rachel hadn't eaten since the night before. She had saved the last of her change for a bottle of milk. Caleb promptly refused, too distracted by the chaos around him. Her own hunger didn't matter anymore. It hadn't for months. There was a time when airports had felt magical to her. The whir of planes, the people in suits with clean shoes, the overpriced coffee. Now it just felt like survival. One more space she didn't quite belong in. She tried humming softly, a lullaby her mother used to sing. Golden slumbers kiss your eyes. Smiles await you when you rise. Her voice cracked halfway through, choked by exhaustion and the pressure building in her chest. She looked down at her baby. His tiny fist clutched her sweatshirt. His cheeks were red and wet. He looked so much like his father, a thought that came uninvited and lingered too long. She looked around for a seat. The terminal was nearly full. A flight to Denver had just been delayed and people were slumped into every available spot, except one, seat 23C. A man sat alone, a few rows down, his laptop closed on his lap. He looked out of place, not just because of his clean-cut navy blazer or the expensive watch visible beneath his sleeve. It was the way he was still calm, watching. Rachel hesitated, not because she recognized him, but because sometimes, even when the world feels like it's closing in, something tells you where to go. She adjusted Caleb on her shoulder and walked toward the empty seat beside him. "Is this taken?" she asked, her voice quieter than she meant. He looked up. His eyes were a deep blue, not cold, not amused, but aware. "No," he said simply, then stood and stepped aside so she could sit. "Thanks." She dropped into the chair like a deflated balloon, careful not to wake Caleb, who had finally stopped crying and was now hiccuping in soft intervals. Her arms ached, her knees trembled, but for the first time in hours, she exhaled. The man didn't say anything, just sat beside her, back straight, hands clasped together loosely. She glanced at him sideways. He was clean-shaven, early 30s maybe, the kind of man who probably had a driver waiting at the other end of his flight. He didn't look annoyed, didn't even glance at Caleb, just waited. Rachel wasn't sure why, but that made her feel safer than she'd felt in days. "Rough day?" he asked, after a long stretch of silence. She looked down at her lap, then chuckled dryly. "You could say that." He nodded once. "Been there. Not exactly that, but close." Rachel didn't ask what he meant. She didn't have the energy to unpack someone else's pain, not right now. But then Caleb stirred and let out a soft, sleepy groan. The man turned his head, finally noticing the child for the first time, and he smiled not politely, but genuinely. "How old?" "Almost 10 months." She replied, "Boy or girl?" "Boy." "Caleb. Nice name." He said, "Strong." Rachel offered a faint smile. She didn't explain where the name came from or why she chose it. That story was wrapped in hospital hallways and broken promises. Their flight was called Moments Later. Boston. Final boarding. She stood slowly, her body heavy, her spirit heavier. As she moved toward the gate, the man spoke again. "If you need help with your bags, I don't mind." She looked at him, not with gratitude, not yet, with suspicion. She was used to kindness that came with conditions, but he simply waited, no strings in his tone. "I've got it," she said softly, but she hesitated, just a second longer, before walking away. Rachel balanced Caleb on one hip as she stepped onto the plane, her other hand clutching the frayed handle of her duffel bag. The line was moving slow, too slow, and she felt the pressure building behind her as passengers sighed and shuffled impatiently. "Sorry," she murmured over her shoulder to no one in particular, instinctively. It wasn't the first time she apologized for taking up space. Probably wouldn't be the last. She finally reached her row and saw the man again, James already seated by the window. He glanced up, recognizing her, and gave a faint nod. Rachel took the middle seat without a word. She was used to silence. Silence didn't judge. She eased Caleb into her lap, praying he'd stay asleep just long enough for the plane to take off, just long enough to avoid the eye rolls and comments. As the plane taxied, she let her thoughts drift not by choice, but because exhaustion was stronger than willpower. Her eyes burned, and her throat felt thick, and in that blur of motion and noise, the memories came, uninvited but familiar. It had started with a phone call. She was 26, working nights at the grocery store, just trying to hold on. Her boyfriend Ryan had promised to pick her up after shift, but instead, he sent a message. "This isn't what I signed up for. I'm sorry." 3 weeks later, she found out she was pregnant, and Ryan, he'd vanished, like mist, changed his number, moved states, left her holding a pink test and 1,000 unanswered questions. She had stared at that tiny plus sign for over an hour, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, wondering if the fear clawing through her chest would ever ease. It never really did. Her parents were long gone, a car accident when she was 20. Her older sister, Claire, had tried to be there for a while, but after Rachel chose to keep the baby, something shifted between them. "You don't have to do this," Claire had said over coffee that turned cold. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." "I'm not," Rachel replied. I just can't turn away from him. Even now. Claire had shaken her head. You're throwing your life away for a mistake someone else made. And that was the last real conversation they'd had. Rachel had moved into a small one-bedroom on the edge of Phoenix. The building creaked, the pipes whined, and the paint peeled in corners. But it was hers. She worked 2 jobs, cashier and dog walker, while Caleb grew inside her. Kicks in the night, hiccups after every peanut butter sandwich. She talked to him when no one else would listen. She had become a woman who couldn't afford sick days or flat tires. A woman who didn't cry when she skipped meals, because at least Caleb's bottle was full. A woman who knew exactly how many diapers she had left and how long she could stretch the last can of formula. People always assumed women like her had made bad choices. What they never saw was how many good ones she'd made to stay afloat. Like the time she turned down a better-paying job because it meant no flexibility for daycare, or when she walked 5 miles home because the bus money had to go toward laundry soap, or when she stayed up 3 nights in a row, taking extra shifts, just so Caleb could have a winter coat that didn't come from a bin. Rachel didn't see herself as strong. She didn't have the luxury. She was simply surviving. Back on the plane. The captain's voice crackled overhead. Caleb stirred. Rachel reached for his blanket, soft, worn, with a fading duck pattern, and tucked it under his chin. Then she looked out the window, past James, at a sky fading to dusk. She caught her reflection in the glass dark circles, dry lips, eyes dulled from too much giving. She didn't recognize herself anymore, not fully. And yet, she wasn't lost. She was still here, still holding on, still choosing Caleb, every single day. You always travel alone, James asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Rachel blinked. She didn't know why that question made her throat tighten. Yeah, she said. Most of the time. He nodded, not pressing, but something in his tone felt knowing, not pitying, just present. She thought of asking him something in return, but the words tangled on her tongue. What would she even say? What do you do? Where are you going? Do you always look this put together while sitting next to people who are falling apart? Instead, she whispered, he doesn't usually cry like that. He just hasn't slept well in days. James turned slightly in his seat, his expression soft. You don't have to explain. Rachel didn't know how to respond to kindness without defense, so she stayed quiet. But inside, something shifted, a small release, like the pressure valve loosening. And for the first time in what felt like years, she let herself wonder what it might feel like to rest. Not just sleep, but rest. The plane leveled out somewhere above the clouds, and the soft hum of the engines filled the silence between them. Rachel sat perfectly still in seat 23B, her body tense despite the stillness around her. Caleb had drifted into a shallow sleep, his little mouth parted, one hand resting on her collarbone. His breathing was soft, steady. She couldn't remember the last time he'd looked this peaceful. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm amber hue across the rows. Flight attendants moved quietly down the aisles, offering drinks and rustling plastic cups. Rachel shook her head politely when asked, her mind too full for sips of soda. James Archer, the man beside her, hadn't said much since takeoff. He'd offered a smile when she buckled Caleb in, a brief glance when the baby stirred, but otherwise kept to himself. Yet, there was something in the way he sat, attentive but unintrusive, that made Rachel acutely aware of his presence. She turned to him after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you heading home? James looked up from the small, leather-bound notebook he'd been scribbling in. His pen paused mid-word. "No," he said. "Business trip." "Oh, you visiting someone," she replied vaguely. "My sister." He nodded slowly. "Haven't seen her in a while." "2 years," Rachel said. "She's getting married. I was invited out of guilt, not love." James didn't flinch, just listened, eyes steady. Rachel sighed, then laughed quietly, almost to herself. "Sorry, that's probably more than you wanted to know." "I don't mind," he said, gently closing his notebook. "Sometimes it's easier talking to strangers." She looked at him, then really looked. His clothes were crisp, but not flashy. His hair neatly combed, but a little out of place near the ear, like he'd been running a hand through it all day. His hands were clean, nails short, with a small scar across his left knuckle, the kind of scar that came from childhood bikes or stubborn kitchen drawers. There was something about him that felt both polished and worn, like a man who had seen things but didn't speak of them. "I didn't catch your name," Rachel said, feeling braver than usual. "James." "Rachel." He smiled. "Nice to meet you." "Rachel?" She shifted slightly, feeling Caleb press closer into her chest, a weight she both cherished and carried like armor. James watched the baby for a long moment before speaking again. "He's beautiful." "Thanks." "His name's Caleb." James looked away for a second, as if tasting the name silently. Then he nodded, like it belonged. "Parenting. That's the real work," he said softly. "The kind no one gives you awards for." Rachel's eyes welled up at that, not because the words were poetic, but because they were true. Brutally, lovingly true. "Some days," she said slowly, "it feels like I'm treading water. And every morning, I wonder if this is the day I'll finally sink." James didn't respond with platitudes or reassurances. He just sat with her in the quiet, letting the truth hang between them like an old photograph you don't quite know where to place. Rachel didn't know why, but she felt her chest loosen. The flight attendant passed again. This time, James ordered black coffee. Rachel hesitated, then asked for water. When the drinks came, James handed her a napkin she didn't ask for. On it, in small, careful script, was a quote: "Be kind. For everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." Ian McLaren. Rachel looked down at the napkin, then at James. "You carry quotes around with you." He smiled, almost sheepishly. "Sometimes helps me say the right thing when I don't know how." "That's unexpected. I get that a lot." Somewhere over Missouri, the cabin darkened, people reclined, headphones buzzed softly, babies murmured in sleep. Rachel closed her eyes, but didn't sleep. Not really. She was listening to the man beside her, to the gentle rhythm of Caleb's breath, to the part of her that hadn't felt seen in a very long time. Then, for no reason she could name, she whispered into the dark, "You know, sometimes I forget what it felt like to just be me." James didn't answer immediately, and when he did, it was in a voice quieter than the cabin itself. "Maybe that's not your fault." Rachel turned her head, just enough to meet his gaze. His eyes weren't intense, just present, and in them, she didn't see curiosity or sympathy. She saw space, room, a mirror, maybe. And for the first time in years, she wondered just maybe she wasn't invisible after all. The cabin lights had been dimmed for over an hour now. Somewhere beyond the clouds, night had fully settled. The sky outside the window was a quiet black, punctuated by distant stars that shimmered faintly, like soft promises barely spoken. Rachel shifted in her seat, trying not to jostle Caleb. Her left arm had gone numb, her right shoulder ached, and her eyes burned from holding back tears. She hadn't cried, not really, not since the delivery room, not when Ryan left, not even when the power had gone out in mid-January and she'd huddled with Caleb under 3 blankets, shivering until sunrise. She'd become skilled at not breaking, but now, in this quiet space at 32,000 feet, with Caleb sleeping and a stranger beside her who somehow made the silence feel less cruel, her armor began to crack, her head tilted, not out of intent, not even exhaustion, just instinct, and landed gently on James's shoulder. At first, she didn't notice. The moment was feather-light, almost accidental, but James didn't flinch, didn't shift. He simply looked down for a second, just enough to see a few strands of her hair resting against his blazer, and exhaled. A small breath, a meaningful one. Rachel didn't stir. Her breathing grew deeper. Caleb murmured in his sleep, but didn't wake. James turned his gaze back forward. The window reflected his own face faintly, framed now by a woman and a child who had no idea who he really was. And for the first time in a long while, he felt still. Not the kind of stillness that came from wealth or success or long meetings in tall offices, but the kind that whispered, "This is what matters." He glanced down at Caleb's chubby fingers, curled into Rachel's sweater. Then, at Rachel, her face soft in sleep, lines of fatigue fading slightly under the warm cabin light. She looked nothing like the polished women he often met at charity galas or investor dinners. And yet, something about her felt truer than any of them. There was quiet resilience in her expression, a kind of brave tenderness, like someone who had been disappointed again and again, and still chose to show up. James shifted slightly, not to move away, but to settle deeper. His mother would have loved Rachel, he thought suddenly. That was a strange thing to think, and it startled him. Maria Archer had raised him alone in a walk-up apartment above a nail salon in Pittsburgh. She had scrubbed floors by day and waited tables by night. She never remarried, never had time. She once told him, "James, the strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who've had to make peace with being invisible." He hadn't understood that at 8 or 15. But he understood it now, staring at a sleeping woman who carried her life in a single duffel bag and still somehow made space for love. Rachel stirred slightly. Her lips parted. A soft, unconscious sigh escaped. James didn't move. Instead, he closed his eyes, just for a moment, and for the first time in a very long time, allowed himself to rest, too. The flight continued in silence. Outside, the moon cast silver shadows across the wings. Inside, an unspoken moment unfolded. No grand gestures, no romance movie soundtrack, just the quiet miracle of two people leaning into the same breath, not because they were in love, not yet, but because something had started. When the turbulence began, it was mild, a gentle rock. Rachel blinked awake, confused, disoriented. She realized she was leaning on someone warm, steady. "Oh my God," she whispered, sitting up quickly, cheeks burning. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I just—" James turned to her, completely unbothered. "You were tired," he said simply. "Don't apologize for being human." Rachel clutched Caleb instinctively. He was still sleeping. Thank God. Her voice came out rough. "I'm not used to that." To what? Letting go. Even for a second. James studied her for a long beat. Then, very gently, said, "Maybe that's what strength really is. Not holding on all the time." but knowing when to let someone share the weight. Rachel didn't know what to say to that. It was too real, too close, so she just nodded, quietly. And for a few minutes more, they sat side by side, not speaking, but breathing the same silence, the kind that no longer felt empty. Caleb woke with a start. It was the kind of sharp, breathless cry that startled even Rachel before she was fully conscious. She had dozed off again, not deeply, just enough to lose track of the cabin around her. The lights were dim, the plane cruising smooth, but her son's sudden wail cut through the quiet like a blade. She fumbled, gently bouncing him in her arms. "Shh, baby. It's okay. It's okay. Mama's here." Caleb arched his back and cried harder, his small fists flailing. Rachel's anxiety surged. People were already beginning to stir the annoyed shift of bodies, the inevitable turning of heads. She could feel it coming. The judgment, the heat of it, pressing into the back of her neck like a silent accusation. "I'm sorry," she whispered again to no one in particular, voice cracking. Beside her, James moved. Not with alarm, not with discomfort, just calmly. "May I?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Rachel looked at him, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "With Caleb," he clarified. "If you're okay with it, sometimes a different rhythm helps." She hesitated. Every instinct told her to protect, to pull in, to not trust so easily. But then she saw James's hands open, steady, familiar, not hesitant, not awkward, and something in her, exhausted and aching, gave a tiny nod. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. James took Caleb into his arms like he'd done it 1,000 times before. It wasn't the way he held him that surprised Rachel. It was the way Caleb responded within seconds. The baby's cries softened into quiet whimpers. James shifted his weight slightly, cradling Caleb against his chest, and began to hum. Not a tune Rachel recognized, but something soft and rhythmic, almost like the rise and fall of waves. His large hand moved in gentle circles on Caleb's back. Up, pause, down. The baby let out a long breath and, just like that, fell asleep. Rachel blinked. "How did you?" she asked, more in awe than confusion. James glanced down at Caleb, then smiled softly. "My sister has twins. I've had practice." He didn't elaborate, and Rachel didn't push. But something in the way he said it felt layered, like there was more behind those words than he let on. Still, the gratitude welled up in her chest like something hot and sudden. "Thank you," she whispered. "I haven't seen him calm that fast in weeks." James didn't look smug or proud, just content. "It's okay to let someone help," he said. Rachel nodded, slowly. "I'm just not used to it." She watched as James continued to hold Caleb, adjusting his position slightly to better support the baby's neck. The image hit her harder than she expected. This man, a stranger now, had her son sleeping on his chest. His perfectly tailored jacket was already creased, a damp spot forming near his collar from Caleb's soft drool. Yet he didn't flinch. He didn't reposition. He didn't care. Rachel's throat tightened, not from fear, from the startling realization that she felt safe, not judged, not pitied, just safe. "Do you travel a lot?" she asked, trying to distract herself from the lump rising in her throat. James nodded. "Too much sometimes. For work." "Yes," he said simply. "What do you do?" There was a pause, not long, but just noticeable enough. "Business consulting," he said, eyes still on Caleb. Rachel tilted her head slightly. "Sounds vague." He chuckled. "It is, on purpose." She gave him a mock suspicious glance. So you're either CIA or a yoga instructor. I prefer mysterious humanitarian, he said with a grin. She laughed, the sound surprising even to her. A short, real laugh, not the tired one she gave to Caleb in the grocery store checkout line. For a moment, she let herself forget the motel reservation, the unpaid bills, the way her sister's voice had sounded flat and reluctant on the phone. For a moment, it was just this: a baby, a man, a stranger, and her floating above the world in a pocket of peace. Across the aisle, a flight attendant passed and did a subtle double take when her eyes landed on James. Her professional smile faltered, but only for a second. Then she kept walking. Rachel noticed. She turned to James, one brow raised. Do you know her? James shrugged, too casually. No. Why she looked at you like you're famous? Or like I forgot to return my tray table, he joked. But Rachel didn't let it go. She filed it away not out of suspicion. Not yet. But curiosity had been planted. And if there was one thing motherhood hadn't taken from her, it was the ability to read between silences. The lights dimmed further as the pilot announced they'd begin their descent in about 35 minutes. James handed Caleb back to her, carefully, and the weight of her child settled into her arms again, warm, breathing, safe. Rachel held Caleb close, but found herself watching James. There was something about his hands, the way he moved, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he didn't just see her, he saw through her. And while she didn't know who he really was yet, she was starting to believe he might just be someone worth knowing. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Rachel blinked toward the cabin lights as the captain's voice buzzed through the intercom, low and calm. We'll begin our descent into Boston shortly. Please ensure your seats are in the upright position. Her arms tightened around Caleb. He was still asleep, his little body soft against her. Outside the window, city lights began to flicker in the distance, a map of orange and white lights stitched across the dark landscape below. Rachel wasn't ready to land. Not yet. Not because of Boston. Not because of her sister, but because something had happened mid-air quiet, unspoken, and she didn't know how to hold it once they touched down. James sat beside her, unusually quiet, his eyes on the skyline. Rachel stole a glance at him. He looked the same: clean lines, calm face, that quiet steadiness. But something about him now felt different, not in what he'd done, but in what he hadn't said. Her fingers brushed over Caleb's blanket. The hum of the engines filled the silence. You never said what kind of business you're in, she said gently. James smiled without turning. I didn't. Do you always answer questions with riddles? He finally looked at her. Only when I think the truth might get in the way. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Of what? Of being seen. She stared at him a beat longer. Her heart pulled in two directions, curiosity and warning. One saying lean in, the other saying pull away. She didn't respond. The plane landed with a soft bump and a long sigh. People began to move immediately, rustling coats, snapping open overhead bins, muttering about meetings and connections. Rachel stayed seated, waiting for the crowd to thin. James didn't move, either. Caleb stirred in her arms, blinking awake with a yawn and a soft cry. Rachel kissed his forehead. We're here, sweet boy. She stood, adjusting her bag, one hand supporting Caleb. Here, James said, reaching up and retrieving her duffel like it weighed nothing. She almost said no, but something in her, maybe the tiredness, maybe the trust she hadn't meant to grow, let it slide. Thank you. They stepped into the aisle together. In the terminal, the lights were fluorescent and too bright. Rachel blinked as they emerged into the stream of passengers. The walls buzzed with announcements and fast footsteps. She shifted Caleb on her hip, scanning for signs: baggage claim, ground transportation, restrooms. Then a voice called out, casual but confident. James Rachel turned instinctively. A woman in a navy blue blazer and lanyard approached, tall, polished, purposeful. Her smile was practiced, not personal. "I didn't know you were on this flight," the woman said. "I thought you were flying first class." James hesitated. His eyes darted quickly to Rachel. "Last-minute change," he said, too smoothly. The woman nodded, glancing at Rachel and Caleb, clearly curious but polite. "Your assistant said to expect you at the event by 8. Car's outside." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. James's assistant, first class, an event, a car waiting. The woman turned and walked away, her heels clicking like punctuation. Rachel looked at James. Her voice was low, even. "Care to explain?" James inhaled slowly. "Rachel, you lied." "I didn't lie." "You said business consulting." "You let me believe. I never claimed to be someone else." "You let me fall asleep on your shoulder," she said, her voice rising. "You held my baby. You sat there like some grounded mystery man when the truth is, you're someone else entirely. It didn't change how I treated you." "No," Rachel said, stepping back, "but it changes how I feel about it." She turned away, walking toward the terminal chairs, needing space. Her heart pounded not from betrayal, but from shame. She had opened herself, trusted, let down her guard. She felt foolish. Caleb whimpered again. She sat, bouncing him softly, her back to James. He approached after a minute. "I didn't sit back there to deceive you," he said quietly. Rachel didn't look at him. "I do run a company. Yes. I'm in town for a series of meetings, one of them at a nonprofit I fund. I fly economy sometimes because I like seeing what the world actually looks like." Rachel turned. Finally. "Did you pick me on purpose? No. But once you saw me, a tired woman with a baby, was I just a story waiting to be rescued?" His eyes softened. "No." "Then why the secrecy?" James hesitated. "Because the moment people find out who I am, they either ask for something or shut down. I didn't want that with you." Rachel folded her arms. "You still had a choice. James, you had power. I didn't." Those words sat between them, heavy and true. James nodded, slowly. "I understand." Rachel stood, adjusting Caleb. "I don't want charity. This wasn't that." "Then what was it?" He didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't sure she wanted to hear it. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and disappointment. Rachel closed the door with the quietest click she could manage, careful not to wake Caleb, who had finally fallen back to sleep in her arms after a long, uneasy ride from the airport. She stepped past the frayed curtain, past the chipped dresser, past the buzzing mini-fridge humming like a tired old man. She laid Caleb down gently on the single double bed, propping a rolled-up towel to keep him from rolling off. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, staring across the room at the mirror above the sink. The reflection wasn't unfamiliar, but it wasn't comforting either. Dark circles, hair matted from the plane, a smudge of dried formula on her sleeve. The kind of tired that ran deeper than the body, that lived in the bones. She swallowed hard. The encounter with James replayed in her head like a bad loop, not because of what he did, but because of what she'd let herself believe. "I don't want charity." She had said that, loud, firm. But what she hadn't said, what she didn't want to admit even now, was that a part of her had hoped desperately hoped that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't too good to be true. That maybe someone like him could see, someone like her really see and not turn away. But now she wasn't sure if she was angry at him or at herself. She stood and walked to the mirror, leaned in. There she was, the woman who had labored alone in a dim hospital room, gripping her own thigh through contractions because there was no hand to hold. The woman who'd learned to stretch a box of mac and cheese into 3 meals. Who'd made a birthday cake out of pancake mix and applesauce because it's what she had. The woman who hadn't asked for help, because help always came with a price. She whispered to her reflection, "Why does being seen always have to feel like being exposed?" The mirror didn't answer, but behind her own eyes, something stirred a memory. 2 years ago, the coffee shop on 6th and Glenmore. Claire had sat across from her, in a pressed blazer and expensive flats, sipping an oat milk latte and talking in that tone, half worry, half judgment. "You don't have to keep this baby, Rachel. You're barely scraping by. You're doing this out of guilt or pride, not logic." Rachel had kept her face neutral. "I'm doing this because I love him. Even before he's born." Claire's mouth had tightened. "That's not enough. Love won't pay rent or health insurance. You're not being strong. You're being reckless." And then Rachel had said the one thing that ended everything: "I'd rather be reckless with love than safe in silence." Claire had stood, left. They hadn't spoken since. Rachel blinked away the sting in her eyes and ran cold water over her wrists. The motel sink creaked in protest. She glanced over at Caleb, still asleep. His legs splayed wide like a starfish, his tiny chest rising and falling. She envied that peace. The ache in her chest grew heavier, not because she wanted luxury, or romance, or a way out, but because she had wanted connection, without agenda, without strings. And the worst part was, James had felt real until he didn't. She heard the buzz of her phone on the dresser, a message from a number not saved in her contacts, but familiar in structure, local. She hesitated before unlocking the screen. "Rehearsal dinner is at 7 tomorrow. You're still coming to the wedding?" "Right." Rachel stared at the words for a long time. No emojis, no warmth. But the fact that Claire had texted at all, that was something. She started typing a reply, deleted, typed again, settled on yes. "I'll be there." She hit send, then lay down beside Caleb, pulling the thin motel blanket over both of them. She didn't cry. She didn't sleep right away either. She just stared at the ceiling, wondering if it was worse to be seen and misunderstood or never seen at all. The knock on the door was soft but deliberate. Rachel blinked up from the creased motel blanket, her body stiff, her eyes grainy from a sleep that never quite reached her bones. Caleb stirred beside her, letting out a small grunt before settling back into slumber. She rose slowly, wrapped herself in the cardigan she used as a pillow, and tiptoed to the door. She didn't expect room service, didn't expect James, didn't expect anyone. But when she looked through the peephole, her breath caught. Claire, dressed in a cream-colored coat, hair pinned back in that immaculate way she always wore it, as if chaos never touched her. Claire Whitman stood in the hall, looking both completely composed and completely lost. Rachel hesitated before opening the door. The hallway light cast a harsh glow over the room's peeling wallpaper and threadbare carpet, making the contrast between the two sisters feel even sharper. "Claire," Rachel said, voice low. "I came to talk." Rachel leaned against the doorframe. Now Claire's eyes flicked toward the number on the door. I figured it wouldn't be a long visit. Rachel didn't answer, just stepped aside. Claire entered like someone walking through a space that didn't belong to them. She glanced at the cracked sink, the sagging mattress, the towel Rachel had stuffed under the door to block the draft. But to her credit, she didn't comment. She sat carefully on the only chair, the one with the broken armrest Rachel had propped up with her suitcase. Rachel remained standing. Caleb murmured again, "Still sleeping." "So," Rachel said. What changed? Claire looked down at her hands. They were clasped tightly in her lap. "I owe you an apology," she began, eyes not meeting Rachel's. "That's a first." Claire exhaled sharply. "I deserve that." Rachel said nothing. The motel hum filled the quiet, the mini fridge, the heater, the world trying to be normal. Claire swallowed. 2 years ago, when we fought, I said a lot of things I shouldn't have. That you were irresponsible, that you were throwing your life away. You were clear, Rachel said coldly. I was cruel, Claire corrected. Then, her voice dropped lower. And I was pregnant. Rachel blinked. What Claire's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother hiding. I didn't tell anyone. Not even Michael at first. We'd been trying for almost a year. When I found out you were pregnant, and you weren't even trying, I was angry, furious, even. Rachel took a slow step backward, absorbing the words. Claire continued, her voice trembling. I lost the baby 2 weeks after our fight. A miscarriage. At home. Alone. Rachel's throat tightened. Claire, I couldn't face you after that. I didn't want to admit that I was jealous. That I judged you because you had something I couldn't hold on to. For a moment, the only sound was the brittle rattling of the heater by the door. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, beside Caleb, her hand resting on his leg. I thought you hated me, she whispered. For keeping him. For not listening to you. I was grieving, Claire said. And I took it out on you. I made you feel small, like you didn't deserve to be a mother. When the truth is, you've been more of a mother than I ever learned how to be. Rachel blinked quickly. Tears were close, but she was still holding them back. She glanced down at Caleb, his cheeks flushed from sleep, one foot twitching under the blanket. I didn't know, she said. I didn't want you to, Claire replied. At the time, I couldn't stand being pitied. I thought distance would keep it from hurting. It didn't, Rachel said quietly. No, Claire agreed. It never does. They sat there in silence. 2 women, 2 different paths. But now, finally, on the same road, even if only for a few steps. Claire wiped her eyes, voice steadier now. That man from the flight, James? He called my office yesterday. Rachel's head snapped up. What? He said he was trying to reach you but couldn't get through. Somehow he found out I was your sister. Asked if we could meet. Rachel's stomach dropped. You met with him. Claire nodded. At first, I thought he was just some wealthy guy chasing a story. But then he started talking about you, not your circumstances. You, your courage, your grace. The way Caleb calmed in his arms like he belonged there. Rachel's lips parted, but no words came out. Claire leaned forward. He said he wasn't offering you charity. He said you reminded him why he started his foundation in the first place. What foundation? Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire reached into her coat and handed over her phone. The screen showed an article from a major news outlet. Whitmore Industries launches National Housing Initiative for Single Mothers in memory of CEO's late mother, Maria Archer. Rachel read the headline once, twice. The photo below showed James Archer in a charcoal suit, holding giant scissors in front of a modest apartment complex. Her heart pounded in her chest. He said he flies economy sometimes because he wants to stay connected to the people his programs serve, Claire said gently. But he didn't sit next to you on purpose. He stayed because he saw something in you, something worth showing up for. Rachel's voice cracked. Why didn't he tell me who he was? Because he was afraid you'd see the title, not the man. She looked back at Caleb, now breathing slowly, eyes fluttering in dream. He might have been right, Rachel whispered. Maybe, Claire said. But that doesn't mean it has to end that way. The reception hall buzzed like a hive, champagne glasses clinking, laughter rising, silverware tapping against plates. Rachel stood just outside the grand ballroom of the Beacon Hotel, her palms slick with nerves, the emerald green dress Claire had lent her clinging slightly to her skin. She wasn't sure what she was doing there. She'd left Caleb upstairs in the care of the hotel sitter, a kind woman named Lillian who reminded her of her late aunt. Caleb had giggled when Lillian made animal sounds and grabbed her necklace like it was the most magical toy in the world. But now, standing behind the heavy doors, Rachel felt stripped bare. She'd dressed like she belonged, but inside, she still carried the motel air, the history, the doubt. And then she saw him, through the glass, seated alone at a table near the edge of the dance floor. James Archer looked nothing like the man from seat 23C. He wore a black tuxedo, crisp white shirt, his dark hair swept back. His posture was relaxed. But his eyes, they never stopped scanning the entrance. They were looking for her. Rachel stepped inside slowly. Their eyes met instantly. James stood. The noise of the party dimmed, as if someone had lowered the world's volume. He walked toward her, not rushed, not tentative, just steady. When he reached her, he stopped a few feet away. I was afraid you wouldn't come, he said softly. Rachel nodded. I almost didn't. Silence settled between them like a soft fog. But someone told me, she added, that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It just means showing up anyway. James's smile flickered with something like relief. She sounds wise. She is. Finally. James exhaled, eyes flicking down and back up. You look different, beautiful, he said. But yes, different. Like you're standing taller. Rachel gave a half smile. I'm still shaking inside. So am I, James said. They stood in the golden light of the chandeliers, hearts exposed beneath tuxedo fabric and borrowed lace. And then Rachel asked what she came to ask. Why didn't you tell me? James nodded slowly, already expecting the question. Because I didn't want you to like me because of who I was. Or worse, not like me because of it. She didn't interrupt. He continued. I've spent most of my adult life walking into rooms where people already knew my name, knew my net worth, knew what they could gain from standing next to me. You didn't. You looked at me and saw a man holding your baby. And for the first time in a long time, I got to just be someone. Rachel looked away for a moment, emotions tightening her chest. But you let me think you were someone else. James stepped closer, voice low but steady. I never claimed to be poor, or broken, or anything I wasn't, but I also didn't know how to say, hi, I'm a billionaire CEO, and I'm trying not to be alone tonight. That sounds ridiculous. She almost laughed. Almost? James's voice softened. I told you my sister had twins. That was true. I told you I travel for business. Also true, but what I didn't say is, I started a foundation in my mother's name, Maria Archer. She raised me alone after my father left when I was 7. 3 jobs, 1 pair of shoes between us. Most nights. She went to bed hungry. Rachel's breath caught, I started with nothing, he said. So when I saw you bouncing Caleb, apologizing to strangers, holding yourself together by threads, I didn't see a charity case. I saw her. I saw me. Rachel finally met his eyes. Why me? Because you didn't ask for anything, he said. Because you didn't flinch when I offered help. Because you said no, even when you were drowning. And then later, you let yourself lean on someone. That takes a different kind of strength. Rachel swallowed hard. You don't know me, James. I know enough, he said. I know that Caleb didn't cry in my arms. I know you carry shame that isn't yours. I know you think love has to be earned through suffering, but it doesn't. Her eyes filled. James stepped even closer now, just enough to let his voice drop to a whisper. I don't want to save you, or fix you. I just want to stand beside you. If you'll let me. Rachel didn't speak, not right away. She just looked at him and saw, not the CEO, but the man from seat 23C, who hummed lullabies, who carried diaper bags without flinching, who never once looked at her like she was less. Finally, she said, I'm still not sure what to do with this. James nodded. That's okay. I'll wait. Then he paused. And I meant what I said before. Caleb, I already love him. Not because he's yours, but because he's his own. And somehow, he's ours now, too. If you want that. Rachel's tears broke. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel weak for crying. She felt found. The music drifted through the open doors, soft jazz now, the tempo slow, elegant, the kind that invited a quiet sway more than a show. Rachel stood just outside the dance floor, her hands still trembling slightly from the conversation, from the weight of everything said and everything forgiven. Caleb was upstairs, fast asleep. According to the short message Lillian had just texted, he's out like a light, dreaming of flying, maybe, or pancakes. She smiled, then looked across the room. James was still standing there, just inside the edge of the ballroom, as if waiting to see if she'd run or return. She didn't hesitate this time. She walked toward him. Do you dance? She asked. James smiled. Badly. Good, she said, reaching for his hand. Then we'll match. He took her hand gently, like something sacred, not claimed. They stepped onto the floor, unnoticed by most, just another couple among many. But for Rachel, the room seemed to narrow down to only them. James placed his hand lightly on her waist. She rested hers on his shoulder. His touch was warm, steady. They swayed slowly, the kind of dance without choreography, just movement, just breath, just a rhythm they found together. Rachel leaned her head slightly against his chest. Do you believe in second chances? She asked. Not looking up, James didn't answer right away. Then I believe in first real chances, disguised as second ones. She smiled. That's a very CEO thing to say. I'll take that as a compliment. They danced in silence for a while. The lights dimmed to a golden hue. Laughter echoed from nearby tables. Glasses clinked again. The scent of roses and champagne lingered in the air. But Rachel, for the first time in years, wasn't thinking of bills or diapers or being watched. She wasn't worrying about who was judging her or what she was lacking. She was just here, whole. I still don't know how this works, she said softly. We don't have to, James replied. We just keep showing up, and if I mess up, then we start again. She tilted her head up. You really mean that I do? A pause. Also, he added, Caleb already drooled on me. That's legally binding. Rachel laughed. A full, clear laugh that made him close his eyes for a moment. That's sound, James said. That's what I was hoping to hear again. The music shifted into something slower, almost cinematic. Rachel looked up at him again. Tell me something. No one knows. James thought for a moment. I used to read the same bedtime book every night from age 6 to 12, he said. Where the wild things are. I believed the monsters were just lonely. Rachel smiled. They probably were. He asked, You? She looked at him for a long second, then said, When I first found out I was pregnant, I was scared, but also, weirdly, at peace, like something in the universe finally had a place for me. James held her hand tighter. You are that place, he whispered. For him? For me? They slowed their steps. The song faded into applause from the other end of the ballroom, where Claire was now giving a short toast. Rachel caught her sister's glance. Claire smiled, raised her glass toward her, not to celebrate a decision made, but a journey survived. Rachel blinked once, slowly, then nodded, later that night, in the quiet corridor outside the elevators. James reached for her hand again. You don't owe me anything, he said. I know, but I'd like to be there. For whatever's next. Rachel looked up at him. You already are. The elevator door chimed. They stepped inside together, side by side. No promises written in the stars. Just two people who met by accident, chose to listen, and decided that maybe, just maybe, some strangers aren't strangers at all. Upstairs, Caleb dreamed of clouds and lullabies, and maybe, just maybe, of a world that held him gently. Sometimes, the smallest gestures reveal the truest hearts. A shoulder offered on a plane. A baby soothed without judgment. A woman brave enough to love, even when the world made her feel unworthy. Rachel didn't ask for pity. She asked to be seen. And James? He saw her not for what she lacked, but for all that she carried in silence. This story reminds us that kindness does not require wealth, but power, true power, lies in choosing to uplift someone when you could have walked away. And perhaps, most of all, it asks us to question the quiet ways we, too, judge. How many Rachels have we passed by? How many Jameses are hidden behind titles we assume we understand? Discrimination doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers through cold glances and lowered expectations. Let's do better. Let's choose to see, to stay, to care. If this story moved you, even just a little, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that heal, challenge, and connect us. We'll be back soon with another voice, another heart, and another moment that just might remind you of your own. Until then, take care of each other, and never underestimate the power of being present.